the offering left unclaimed. The village of Vettelper had long known hunger, not the kind that gnawed at the belly, but the kind that festered in the soul, an ancient, insatiable craving that lingered in the air like the stench of spoiled meat. Every new moon, the elders left an offering at the edge of the blackened banyan tree, a bowl of rice, a cup of blood from a freshly slaughtered goat, a handful of jaggery, a plea to keep the hungry one at bay. Tonight the offering sat untouched. Ramesh, the youngest of the temple keepers, had been tasked with placing the dish beneath the gnarled roots. He had done so with trembling hands, his breath shallow, his skin prickling as though 1,000 unseen eyes watched from the dark. The wind had been still, the night too quiet. No rustle of leaves, no distant howl of jackals. Only silence. When dawn came, the bowl remained full. The rice had turned gray. The blood congealed into thick, black sludge. The jaggery had melted, oozing over the rim like pus from a wound. Ramesh stumbled back, his throat tightening. The elders would not like this. The hungry one had refused its meal, and when a Preta refuses food, it only means one thing. It has found something else to feast upon. That night the first scream tore through the village. It came from the widow's hut near the old well, a sound so raw it split the air like a knife through flesh. By the time the men arrived with torches, there was nothing left of her but a wet, glistening stain on the floor. The walls were streaked with red, as though something had dragged its fingers through the blood, savoring every drop, and in the corner, where the shadows clung thickest, something moved. A low, wet sound echoed a mouth, opening, closing, opening again. Hungry, always hungry. Whispers in the dark. The widow's death had not been the end. It had only been the beginning. Vettelper slept fitfully that night, doors barred, windows shuttered, yet no barrier could keep out the thing that slithered through the village like smoke. The air thickened with the scent of iron and rotting fruit, a sickly sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. Children whimpered in their sleep, twisting under thin blankets as if unseen hands plucked at their limbs. The elders muttered prayers, their voices trembling, their fingers clutching amulets that had once held power, but power fades when hunger is this old. Ramesh did not sleep. He sat by the dying hearth, his ears straining against the silence. That was when he heard it, the first whisper, a voice, dry as cracking bones, slithering from the shadows beyond the firelight. Flesh. He jerked upright, his pulse hammering. The embers flickered, casting long, trembling fingers across the dirt floor. Something moved just beyond the glow of shape, hunched and gaunt, its limbs too long, its mouth a yawning black pit. Flesh. Flesh. The whisper came again, this time from the opposite corner, then another and another, until the very walls seemed to breathe the word, a chorus of starved voices wrapping around him like a noose. Ramesh stumbled to his feet, knocking over the clay lamp. Oil spilled, the flame licking hungrily at the floor before dying in a curl of black smoke. Darkness swallowed the hut. Something wet dripped onto his shoulder. He did not scream. His breath froze in his lungs as a cold, skeletal finger traced his collarbone. The stench of decay filled his nostrils, old blood, spoiled meat, the rancid sweetness of a corpse left too long in the sun. Then pain, sharp, deep, a puncture, then a tearing, as if something had bitten into his shoulder and pulled. Warmth gushed down his chest. The whispers rose to a hissing chant, frenzied now, desperate. Flesh, flesh. Ramesh fell to his knees, his vision swimming. The last thing he saw before the dark took him was his own blood pooling on the floor. The shadow leaning over him, its jaws unhinging, its teeth glistening like rusted needles. Outside the village slept on, but not for long. The hollow stomach's cry. Dawn came to Vedelpur, painted in shades of rust. Ramesh's hut stood silent, its door slightly ajar, swinging on creaking hinges with the sluggish morning breeze. Inside, the earthen floor had turned to mud-thick, congealing blood soaking into. The packed dirt streaked in frantic arcs where fingers had clawed for purchase. The air hung heavy with the metallic stench of butchery, the sweetness of opened viscera. They found him by the hearth, though found was too generous a word. What remained of Ramesh was less a man than a husk his torso, hollowed like a gourd. Ribs cracked outward in a grotesque blossom of bone, the cavity within scraped clean. His face remained untouched, frozen in a rictus of disbelief, eyes wide and clouded, as if still watching the thing that had eaten him from the inside out. The village priest, old Aditya, pressed a shaking hand to the boy's forehead. The skin was cold, but not with the chill of death, with something deeper, older, a hunger that had leached the warmth from his flesh before the last breath had even left his lungs. Outside, the women wailed. The men clutched their sickles and axes, their knuckles white, their eyes darting to the tree line. The blackened banyan loomed in the distance, its roots like grasping fingers, and then the sound, a low guttural moan, rolled through the village, vibrating in the bones of every hut, trembling in the teeth of every villager. Not from the forest, not from the earth, from inside them. It started as a twinge of cramp deep in the belly, sharp as a knife twist. Then came the gnawing, the terrible, ceaseless emptiness, as if something were chewing its way out from within. Children doubled over, retching bile. Grown men collapsed, their stomachs seizing. A young mother screamed as her hands flew to her, abdomen only to feel something shift beneath her skin, something that was not hers. The priest stumbled into the square, his robes drenched in cold sweat. His lips moved in silent prayer, but the words crumbled as his own guts clenched. He fell to his knees, and as he did he heard it, the sound that would haunt Vedelpur until its last gasping breath, a wet, echoing gurgle, the cry of a stomach that had never been full. The hungry one was no longer just outside their doors, it was in their blood, in their bones, and it was always starving. Shadows that licked their lips. The hunger had teeth. By the third night, Vedelpur's streets ran with more than fear. Those who still clung to life did so in flickering candlelight, their bellies swollen not with food but with something far worse, a squirming, knowing void that pulsed beneath their skin like a second heartbeat. The village priest, Aditya, had locked himself in the temple, his once steady hands now shaking as he poured rancid ghee over crumbling effigies of forgotten gods. The idols stared back with hollow eyes, their mouths stretched in silent screams. Outside, the shadows moved, not the natural dance of darkness and flame, but something deliberate, something alive. They pooled thicker in corners, stretching like tar, their edges quivering with anticipation. When old Manode stumbled home from the well, his water pot slipped from numb fingers as he saw them. Long, liquid tendrils creeping along the walls of his hut, glistening as they moved. Not just darkness, wetness. He barely had time to scream before the shadows surged. They wrapped around his ankles like vines, cold as grave soil, and pulled. His knees hit the ground with a crack, and then the darkness was on him, slithering. Up his legs, his torso, prying his jaws apart with invisible fingers. His last sight was his own shadow stretching unnaturally long against the wall, before it leaned down and licked his face with a tongue of pure black. By dawn, they found Manoj curled in the fetal position, his skin gray and sunken, his mouth frozen open in a soundless wail. His tongue was gone, his eyes were hollow pits, and his lips were wet. The hunger was learning. It had tasted fear. Now it wanted more. The feast of forgotten sins. The temple bells rang with no hands to move them. Aditya knew then that the gods had abandoned Vidalpur. The bronze clangs echoed through the empty streets, a funeral knell for the damned. Outside, the wind carried the stench of opened bodies, and something worse the sweet, cloying rot of guilt made flesh. The remaining villagers had gathered in the square, their skeletal forms barely recognizable, their bellies distended grotesquely, skin stretched thin as parchment over the writhing. Hunger inside. Children whimpered as their own stomachs rippled, small hands pressing against the movement beneath. A woman clawed at her abdomen, fingernails leaving bloody trails, as she tried to dig out the thing gnawing at her from within. Then the ground began to weep. Black, viscous liquid oozed from between the cobblestones, bubbling up like a spring of long-buried sins. It pooled around their feet, thick as syrup, pulling at their ankles with greedy fingers. Old debts rose to the surface. A farmer who had poisoned his neighbor's well, a wife who had smothered her crying babe, a priest who had taken more than offerings from trembling devotees. The hunger knew. The hunger remembered. One by one, they began to vomit, not bile, not food, but themselves. Ropes of intestines slithered from gaping mouths, coiling on the ground like serpents. Teeth clattered onto stone, followed by thick clots of half-digested flesh. A man screamed as his own liver pushed past his lips, still glistening, still pulsing. The black pools drank it all, the liquid rising higher, lapping at trembling knees. Aditya fell to the ground, his body convulsing. His throat bulged, something forcing its way up. When he opened his mouth, it wasn't organs that emerged, but words made solid. His lies, his secret lusts, his whispered cruelties, all given form as squirming, worm-like things that wriggled into the waiting dark. Above them, the banyan tree's branches creaked, its leaves rustling with terrible satisfaction. The shandisee's branches creaked, its leaves runches creaked, its leaves rustling with terrible satisfaction. Feast had begun, and the hungry one was just getting started. Bones that remember hunger. The earth beneath Vidalpur began to crack. Great fissures split the village square, exhaling the stench of centuries-old graves. From the blackened depths came the rattle of bones, not the quiet rest of the dead, but the terrible stirring of something that had never known satiation. Skeletal fingers clawed at the dirt, rib cages heaved with phantom breath, and hollow eye sockets burned with the same hunger that now consumed the living. Aditya crawled through the carnage, his priestly robe stiff with drying bile. The temple walls had collapsed inward, revealing the ossuary beneath a sacred chamber meant to house the purified bones of ancestors. But there was nothing holy in what emerged. The skeletons moved with unnatural precision, their yellowed bones clicking like insect legs. They fell upon the writhing villagers with a ghastly familiarity, as if recognizing kin. A grandmother's skeleton embraced her still-living grandson, its jaw unhinging to swallow his screams before peeling the meat from his bones with loving care. The village chief's remains dragged itself toward his descendant, its fingers plunging into the man's distended belly to pull out glistening ropes of intestine, feeding itself with the hunger it had passed down through generations. The worst was the children. Their small skeletons emerged last, bones blackened with ancient starvation. They climbed onto the backs of living playmates, tiny fingers working between ribs to pry them apart like cage doors. One child's skeleton pressed its skull against its living twin's chest, listening for the heartbeat before plunging its hands inside to claim it. Aditya's own ancestors found him by the shattered altar. Their bones were the darkest of all, etched with marks of the great famine they'd endured and caused. They surrounded him in a circle of clicking, chattering hunger, their empty sockets staring at the flesh they'd once worn. As their fingers began to peel him apart, joint by joint, Aditya understood the terrible truth. This was no curse brought upon them. This was inheritance. The unseen mouth. Aditya's screams died as his ancestors' bones reassembled themselves inside him. The priest convulsed on the temple floor, his flesh undulating as ancient finger bones threaded through his muscles. Rib cages unfolded in his belly, and skull fragments lodged behind his eyes. His mouth stretched wider than humanly possible, teeth cracking as something pushed up from his throat, not bones. Not vomit, but a wet, pulsing darkness. The remaining villagers watched in paralyzed horror as their priest's body became a gateway. His skin split along invisible seams, peeling back to reveal not blood or muscle, but an endless black void. From that darkness came the sound, a wet, smacking rhythm of lips and tongue, the hungry noise of something vast and ancient tasting the air for the first time in centuries. Then the licking began. Tongues of blackened flesh slithered from Aditya's gaping wounds, each one studded with needle teeth. They lashed out like serpents, wrapping around ankles and wrists, dragging villagers toward the human wound that had been their priest. A young mother kicked wildly as a tongue coiled around her thigh, its barbs sinking deep before peeling the meat away in long, glistening strips. An old man shrieked as a probing tongue forced itself down his throat, expanding until his jaw shattered, then retracted, taking his insides with it in a slick, red torrent. The children suffered worst. The tongues caressed their faces first, almost lovingly, before plunging into soft bellies with the precision of surgeons. Small hands clutched at the invasive flesh as it wriggled deeper, exploring, tasting, claiming. When the tongues retracted, they left behind hollowed-out shells, tiny ribs cradling nothing but dripping shadows. Aditya's body collapsed inward then, his skin folding like wet paper into the void. Where he had knelt now gaped a maw of impossible dimensions, a swirling pit of teeth and grasping tongues, its edges lined with the still gnashing jaws of every villager it had consumed. The hungry one had finally shown its true face, and it was smiling. A hunger that spreads. The river turned black first. What had once carried life through Vedalpur now pulsed with thick, viscous hunger. Fish floated belly up, their bodies bloated then deflated, their insides sucked out through gills and mouths. The water's age reeked of bile and rotting meat, its surface rippling not with current, but with something moving beneath, something vast and ravenous. By mid the sickness reached the neighboring village of Kashmira. It began with the crops. Wheat stalks withered in seconds, their golden sheen turning gray before crumbling to dust. Fruit rotted on branches, bursting open to reveal writhing masses of maggots that moved in unison, forming shapes of screaming faces before dissolving again. Cattle lowed in agony as their stomachs ruptured, intestines spilling out only to be dragged back inside by unseen forces. Then the people started changing. A potter screamed as his hands fused to his latest creation, the wet clay squirming up his arms like a second skin. His mouth sealed shut as the clay filled his nostrils, his muffled screams the last sound before he hardened into a grotesque statue, eyes wide, mouth stretched in a silent howl. Nearby a weaver's threads came alive, slithering around her limbs, stitching her lips shut before plunging down her throat to pull out her tongue in one long, bloody thread. Children playing by the river bank froze mid-laugh as their shadows detached from their bodies. The dark shapes pressed close, embracing their owners with grotesque intimacy before merging flesh and shadow, twisting together into shambling, half-formed things that whimpered with multiple mouths. By nightfall, the trees had begun to bleed. Sap turned thick and crimson, oozing from bark like open wounds. Branches creaked under the weight of strange fruit-fleshy, pulsing orbs that resembled human hearts, each one beating in time to an unseen rhythm. When one dropped, splitting open on the ground, it revealed not seeds but teeth, rows upon rows of jagged, yellowed teeth that chattered hungrily at the moonlight. The hunger had found new mouths to feed, and it was just beginning its feast. The ritual of starvation. The last survivors gathered at the ruins of Vedalpur's temple, their bodies gaunt, their eyes hollow. The hunger had gnawed away everything: food, flesh, sanity. Now only bones and desperation remained. The old text spoke of a way to sat, the unending appetite of a Preta, not with offerings, not with blood, but with absence. To starve the hunger itself, they chose the girl first, little Myra, barely 7 winters old, her ribs pressing against skin like prison bars. She did not cry as they painted her emaciated body with ash, nor when they laid her upon the cracked altar. The hunger had already taken her voice days ago, her tongue shriveled to a blackened stub. The ritual knife, carved from the bone of a saint, trembled in the elder's grip. The blade was not meant to spill blood, but to carve symbols of negation into flesh. Each stroke hissed as it parted skin, the wounds gaping like lipless mouths. Myra's body arched, her silent scream vibrating in the air as the cuts deepened, exposing the hollow where her stomach had once been. The others followed. One by one, they took the knife to their own bodies, carving the same symbols into their flesh. Arms, chests, faces each mark a denial, a refusal, a scream into the void. Blood pooled at their feet, black and thick, but no one faltered. The hunger inside them writhed, recoiling from the sacred wounds, the ancient words of denial burning through veins like poison. Then the ground shook. The blackened banyan tree split down the middle, its roots tearing free from the earth like the legs of a dying spider. From its hollow trunk poured a flood of half-digested things, bones, hair, teeth, all the remnants of the devoured. The hunger screamed through 100 rotting throats, the sound shaking the ruins, sending cracks through the temple walls. The survivors did not stop. They cut deeper. They starved the hunger with their own emptiness. And for the first time in centuries, the Preta knew what it was to be denied. Flesh turned to ash. The air itself began to decay as the last symbols were carved into trembling flesh. The survivors watched their skin turn gray, then brittle like parchment, left too long in the sun. The hunger inside them shrieked, thrashing against their ribs as the ritual took hold. Blood no longer flowed from their wounds. Instead, a fine black powder seeped out, whispering to the ground like dead insects falling from a corpse. Little Myra's body was the first to crumble. Her hollowed stomach caved inward, the skin cracking like dried mud. Then her arms, her legs, her face all collapsing into themselves, disintegrating into swirling motes of ash. The others followed, their bodies unraveling strand by strand, their final breaths escaping as clouds of dust. The elder watched his fingers dissolve, the bone knife clattering to the ground as his hands became nothing more than shadows on the wind. The Preta howled, its form a writhing mass of teeth and tongues and half-digested faces, convulsed as the ritual's power struck it. The creature's stolen flesh blackened, curling at the edges like burning paper. Villagers it had consumed centuries ago tumbled from its gaping maw, their bodies intact but empty, their eyes hollow pits. The banyan tree's roots withered, snapping like old bones as the hunger that had sustained it was ripped away. But the Preta was ancient, and it would not starve alone. With a final, desperate lunge, it seized the dissolving elder, its maw stretching, wide not to consume, but to merge. Flesh and ash swirled together in a grotesque dance, the Preta binding itself to the last remnants of the village, its hunger fusing with their sacrifice. When the wind finally cleared, only two things remained: a single blood-stained bone knife, and a new kind of hunger waiting in the ashes. The Preta's bargain. The ashes stirred, a wind moved through the ruins of Villalpur, not with the careless grace of nature, but with purpose a slow, deliberate gathering of dust and memory. From the scattered remains of the villagers, something took shape. Not flesh, not spirit, but a terrible in-between thing, its form shifting like smoke over embers. The Preta had been weakened, but not destroyed, and it was hungry. The bone knife trembled where it lay, vibrating against the cracked earth. Then, with a sound like cracking teeth, it rose suspended in the air by invisible strings of want. The blade turned slowly, catching the moonlight, and in its reflection stood the last elder, or what remained of him. His body was half there, half not ashes clinging to the suggestion of limbs, his mouth a gaping hole where the hunger had taken root. The Preta's voice slithered through the ruins, not as sound, but as a sudden knowing that lodged in the mind like a worm in fruit. Feed me, and I will give you back what was taken. The words unfolded like a rotting flower, revealing their poisoned center, The elder's ash body convulsed, memories flooding back his wife's laughter, his grandson's small hands, the weight of his years before the hunger came. All of it gone, all of it possible again. The knife turned edged ash up, an offering, a choice. The Preta whispered again, its voice the sound of a starving child. Just one life, just one. And the village breathes again. Somewhere beyond the ruins, a twig snapped. A traveler, lost and weary, drawn by the smell of charred meat that still clung to the air. His footsteps crunched closer, unaware of the shadows pooling at his feet, of the knife hovering in the dark, waiting to be found, waiting to be used. The elder's ashen fingers twitched, the hunger smiled. The last bite. The traveler's scream was cut short. One moment he stood in the ruins, his lantern casting frail light over the ashen ground. The next, the bone knife was in his throat, not thrown, but guided, as if invisible hands had wrapped around his own, and plunged the blade deep. Blood gushed over his fingers, shock widening his eyes as he crumpled to his knees. The elder watched from the shadows, his ashen form trembling. The Preta wasted no time. The ground beneath the traveler split open, blackened, roots surging upward like the veins of some great buried beast. They coiled around his convulsing body, burrowing into the wound at his neck, sliding beneath his skin with wet, squelching sounds. His flesh rippled, then began to sink, collapsing inward, as if his bones had turned to sand. His mouth stretched. In a silent wail as his tongue blackened and shriveled, sucked down his own throat. Then came the feast. From the traveler's emptying skin, shapes emerged, faces. The villagers of Vitalper, their features pressing against the thinning flesh from the inside, mouths gaping, as they fought to consume what little life remained. The elder saw his wife's hollow eyes, his grandson's tiny fingers tearing at the dying man's ribs. They were not alive, not dead, simply hungry. The traveler's body deflated like a wineskin, his skin splitting apart to reveal not organs, but a swirling mass of grasping hands and gnashing teeth. The Preta's true form an amalgamation of all it had ever consumed, bound together by endless want. As the last of the traveler's essence was sucked away, the village flickered. Huts reassembled from dust. The banyan tree's branches unfurled with new, sickly leaves. Shadows moved where no living thing stood. The elder stumbled forward, his ashen body gaining weight, gaining substance. He felt his heartbeat again, felt his lungs expand, and then he felt the hunger stir inside him. Echoes of an eternal craving. The village breathed again, but its lungs were rotten. Vitalper stood whole once more, its huts neatly arranged, its fields golden under the sun. Children's laughter danced through the air. Women sang as they drew water from the well. Men tended to the crops with steady hands. But the elder saw the truth in the spaces between, the way shadows clung too long to familiar faces, how the banyan tree's leaves shivered when no wind blew, the wet, clicking sounds that sometimes echoed from empty stomachs at night. The hunger had not been destroyed, it had been shared. The elder sat by his hearth, fingers tracing the new scars on his belly, thin, jagged lines that formed the same symbols once carved to banish the Preta. His skin itched constantly now, crawling with the memory of ash. When he closed his eyes, he saw the traveler's face, saw the moment the man realized his death, meant nothing more than fuel for an endless cycle. Outside, the first offering bowl was being prepared. The village had remembered the rituals, though none could say how. The rice was perfectly white, the goat's blood freshly spilled, the jaggery sweet as sin. The elder watched as they carried it to the blackened banyan, their steps synchronized like marionettes on strings. That night, as the bowl sat untouched once more, the elder rose from his bed. His feet carried him past sleeping homes, past where the water shimmered with something darker than reflection, to the edge of the forest where the shadows waited. They parted for him, deep in the trees. Something stirred a shape both familiar and alien, its mouth a yawning void, its limbs stretched long with new hunger. It tilted its head, mirroring the elder's movement exactly. The Preta was no longer just in the village, it was in him, in all of them. And as the first scream of the new cycle tore through the night, the elder smiled, his teeth sharpening, his stomach growling, his fingers curling like claws. Some hungers, after all, were never meant to be satisfied.